Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matus Samel. I'm from the Economist Intelligence Unit in London. I'm the lead author of the report Looking Ahead, Economic Policy Options for COVID-19 and Beyond in Central Asia. It is my privilege to share some of the highlights from the report with you today. And thank you very much for your kind invitation to this amazing event. So as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic is a uniquely devastating shock for the global economy. The outbreak caught even the world's largest, most sophisticated economies unprepared. Most governments around the world have been engaged in persistent experimentation, designing and continuously updating stimulus packages and interventions on unprecedented scale and scope. The EIU has developed this report to shed light on the economic impacts of this global downturn in Central Asia and the policy options available to regional governments to respond to it. The continuing spread of the virus has weakened the economic outlook for every region in the world, but it has done so in different magnitudes and through different channels. The global economic outlook for 2020 has worsened dramatically, with the expected growth rates ranging from 1.8% expansion in China, which is the only major economy not expected to contract this year, to about 5 to 6% contraction in the US and Russia, and greater than 10% contraction in the UK, France, Italy, but also India. In North America, for example, a very high number of cases resulted in severe containment measures that triggered an unprecedented surge in unemployment. While in East Asia, a smaller number of cases and tighter labor markets meant a smaller shock to demand, but the region's reliance on exports means that weaker demand elsewhere will still see economies fall into recession. Despite the high level of uncertainty about the virus spread, overall, we are not expecting the global economy to recover to pre-crisis levels before 2022. In Central Asia, initially the countries have registered relatively few cases of the virus, which is likely due to low population densities and relative sort of lack of integration into global economic systems. Mortality rates in all countries in the regions have also been below the global average. Initially, regional governments imposed temporary restrictions on businesses and movement of people to various intensity and speed between March and May. However, as a result of rising cases, countries have been forced to extend or reintroduce these restrictions on national or at least the regional level. Overall, the policy responses in Central Asia have reflected the fact that the nature of the economic shock is different to many advanced economies, and that the region faces specific challenges. So let me address these very briefly. So first of all, the pandemic really exposed the low levels of diversification and high commodity dependence in export markets in the regional economies. So the countries in the region are relatively open and depend on non-diversified portfolio of export markets and products. These are mostly commodities, which leaves them highly exposed to external shocks in terms of external demand and global price fluctuations. So the regional ratio of trade turnover to GDP averages above 65%, and at least 60% of countries' export earnings come from commodities, particularly oil, gas, ores, metal, and cotton. Moreover, exports are concentrated in a few key markets, particularly China, Russia, and some of the Western European countries, whose economies, as we've seen, have been hit very hard by the COVID outbreak. The second big point is that the pandemic highlighted a unique vulnerability of the region that comes from dependency on inflows of remittances. So alongside trade flows, the pandemic and the country's policy responses have interrupted the cross-border movement of laborers who provide vital flows of remittances to help sustain consumption and really reduce poverty in many Central Asian economies. So we know that remittances account for around 50% of Uzbekistan's GDP, but also up to a third of Tajikistan's and Kyrgyzstan. And significant losses of remittances, particularly due to layoffs in Russia, but also border closures and declining wages, will also significantly worsen the current account deficit of the countries that are the leading recipients of remittances in the region. And thirdly, the pandemic has really narrowed an already tight fiscal space, further limiting government's ability to finance the necessary response. So governments in Central Asia already operate with tight fiscal restraints as a result of the dependence and reliance on commodity exports, underdeveloped financial markets, and relatively weak institutional governance. Governments have understandably increased their budget deficit to finance emergency support measures and the economic stimulus plans in response to the COVID outbreak. However, given high levels of public debt and high risk premium that the countries face in the markets, macroeconomic measures have largely focused on stabilizing currencies, which, if they had been allowed to depreciate, would of course push up the cost of imported food and goods in the most difficult of time. And so we have also seen some governments imposing price control and export restrictions on staple foods to prevent prices from escalating. Overall, we do expect that the crisis will have significant negative impacts on regional economies. We expect that real GDP in all countries in the region will decline in 2020 by between half a percentage point in Uzbekistan to up to 5% in Kyrgyzstan. In Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, we expect that the weaker demand for energy will pull down exports, which are, of course, a significant source of economic activity in these countries. While in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, we expect that the remittances inflows will fall sharply in 2020 as especially Russian firms reduce temporary workers amid the twin crisis of the pandemic and the previous oil price war. We expect that Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan could somewhat benefit from a risk aversion related rise in gold prices, provided that their usual supply chains remain operational. But overall, the picture is challenging. Nevertheless, we do believe that the crisis offers some short and long-term opportunities for the countries in the region, and provide inspirations or some examples from other countries around the world who are also facing challenging circumstances. So let me just quickly outline a few of those. So in terms of the short-term responses, one of the things that we have seen is that avoiding complete lockdowns is absolutely essential for keeping economies open, and is particularly important for countries where there is a limited fiscal space for policy response. And so this can be done by deploying surveillance tools such as mobile phone and social media tracking to identify and monitor local outbreaks. Some of these we have already seen in the region. So, for example, the Kazakhstan's video system used for monitoring compliance with the quarantine. But similar programs should be developed and expanded in the region. But very importantly, crucially, it is important that the best practices are pursued in terms of keeping data private, anonymized, and secure. Some countries in especially East Asia offer best practice examples, such as South Korea or Taiwan. So, for example, in South Korea, the health authorities immediately after the first confirmed cases of COVID-19 began conducting surveys and collected large amounts of data on the citizens through mobile phone movements and credit card transactions. But importantly, the data is kept safe through the existing Personal Information Protection Acts, which impose really strict compliance requirements on entities that collect and use this information to identify to monitor outbreaks. Secondly, it is really important that support is provided to people who are outside of the formal economy, especially given the importance of the informal sector in the regional economies. It is essential that these channels are used to provide support for people who are normally outside of the formal economy. Importantly, governments can also improve or increase trust in the state, in the government, and enhance formalization of the economy, which of course are important long-term goals as well. So, for example, we have seen that in Morocco, the government has expanded its unemployment scheme beyond the formal sector to really support households to benefit from non-contributory health insurance and receive through receiving a mobile payment depending on the household composition. And for households who do not benefit from the health insurance, they are able to claim cash support by registering online. And in early spring, already 85% of the eligible households in the informal sector were covered. So it has been very successful. But there are also a few sort of very important long-term measures or considerations that the government should keep in mind. And here, one of the obvious big ones is sort of improving regional cooperation and integration. So we have seen that relatively common response by governments in the region, but also elsewhere, has been to impose export restrictions on staple foods and medical equipment. However, of course, these non-tariff barriers should be removed as quickly as possible when the governments can afford it, to really support the recovery and further improvement in business confidence. And the pandemic has also highlighted the dependence of all countries in the region on international trade, and particularly the value of export receipts. And therefore, deepening the trade cooperation and integration is essential for short-term but also long-term recovery. So the examples that we have in the region, the sort of ongoing C5+1 cooperation talks, should really be expanded and should be really taken advantage of to develop much deeper dialogues with the countries in the region, but also exploring potential new relationships with particular countries that have had a strong performance and innovative performance in this crisis. We have seen, for example, in the government of New Zealand, alongside 10 other countries, committed to ensuring that trade really continues uninterrupted between them, removing trade restrictive measures on essential goods, protecting supply chains, and keeping the ports and airports and seaports open to trade. Secondly, we had really seen that in the long term, digitalization of public and private sector is key factor of resilience. So digital technology holds significant economic potential for Central Asia, especially in terms of facilitating and driving the necessary economic diversification to decrease the reliance on commodity exports and natural resources. However, despite the potential, the region remains one of the least digitally connected regions in the world. And governments should really try to increase companies' awareness of the digital landscape, support, of course, infrastructure development, but also businesses' online development, and collaboration with technology companies to develop and provide digital solutions that are accessible to smaller businesses, not just the large multinationals. A good example that we have seen is a program by the Japanese Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare that offers a comprehensive sort of support and subsidy to SMEs to introduce teleworking during the COVID-19 pandemic, which really covers the costs of equipment, training, but also consultation with experts. Finally, the governments really should be supporting areas with high long-term growth potential. So existing government stimulus packages have, of course, focused on maintaining the access to credit for firms and sort of boosting the social nets for the most vulnerable. But these measures are really suited for the sort of acute phase of the crisis. But as the sort of global growth it remains subdued in the next few years, economies will, to different degrees, require support for the years to come, and it's important for the governments to focus on strategically important and long-term high growth potential sectors that ideally, of course, are focused on high productivity and high levels of diversification in the economies. So, for example, we have seen that South Korea announced a New Deal spending plan to really reshape the economy in the aftermath of the pandemic, including a long-term plan to create up to 500,000 jobs by 2022, and really seek to promote the use of 5G networks and AI and advanced digital technologies across the South Korean economy. So overall, the sort of pandemic has exposed the economic vulnerabilities of Central Asian economies that stem mostly from highly concentrated and undiversified production and export capabilities. It is really, therefore, important for the regional governments to reduce the business uncertainty and really leverage existing comparative and competitive advantage to develop capacities in high potential sectors such as IT, agriculture, textile, renewables, petrochemicals, and others, while avoiding the protectionist trade measures that have really proliferated in the wake of the current crisis. We address these sectors in more detail in our report, but and obviously the opportunities vary from country to country, but it is essential that governments and countries keep this as the sort of center of attention. Because we have seen that although this is an sort of unprecedented crisis that caught many advanced economies unprepared, it is essential that the countries use the opportunities to build economies that are more diversified and better integrated and much more flexible, and that prepares them for the future crisis, because eventually in the long term we do expect that although this is an unprecedented shock, it's not going to be the only one. And I'll just leave it at there. And thank you so much again for your attention. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this amazing event. Thank you so much.